Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Optimizing Your Global Labeling Operations, an Expert Panel Discussion. My name is Diane, and I will be your X-Talks host for today. And today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers, and this webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars works best when you're involved, so please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation. And you could do so by using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. And please note that this event will be recorded and made available for future download. At this point, I would like to thank Sciformix, who developed the content for this presentation. Sciformix Corporation collaborates with life science organizations through the entire product development lifecycle to provide a full range of services from pre to post-marketing support. Their labeling managed services comprises people expertise, streamlined processes, and technology that helps clients achieve quality, compliance, and efficiency. Visit their website at www.sciformix.com and www.sciformix.com/labeling. Now I would like to introduce our speaker and panelists for today's event. Our speaker, Boris Jankowski, will head the panelist discussion for today. Boris joined Sciformix Corporation in January 2014 as Director and Global Head, Solution Architecture Services. In his role, Boris is responsible for corporate solutions offering strategy, development, and evolution, including global labeling. Boris and his team engage directly with existing and prospective clients for the design of end-to-end solutions and alternative operating models within the regulatory affairs, pharmacovigilance, and clinical development domains. Boris joined Sciformix from Amgen, where he supported the RA and PV organizations in various functional and leadership roles within global labeling, benefit, risk communications, operational excellence, and external strategy functions. Prior to Amgen, Boris spent time as a scientist working within the industry and academia with a focus on analytical chemistry, protein biochemistry, and metabolomics. Boris holds an MS in chemistry from the California State University, Fullerton, and an MBA from Pepperdine University. Our first panelist in this discussion is Beth Lager. Beth is an Associate Director of Strategic Global Labeling for Medical Products, Baxter Healthcare Corporation. She has broad experience in content development and management of company core data sheets and pharmaceutical labeling. She provides expertise in formulating global regulatory labeling strategy, assessing impact of labeling regulations, and global labeling implementation management, tracking, and workflow. She holds a BS in medicine and a BS in biology from the University of Iowa. She is a board-certified medical technologist and has a regulatory affairs certification and is currently pursuing her MBA from Lake Forest Graduate School of Management. Our second panelist in this discussion is Griya Mangru. Griya joined Pfizer in 2009 as a regulatory strategist supporting in-licensed generics. She is currently a labeling strategist on the global labeling management team, and prior to joining Pfizer, Griya held a regulatory and quality positions at Sandoz, Eon Labs, and Estée Lauder. She holds a bachelor's in chemistry from the State University of New York at Stony Brook and a master's in pharmaceutical marketing and healthcare administration from Long Island University. Our third panelist is Craig Troutman. As the CEO of Integris, Craig's primary responsibility is driving the strategic initiatives, plans, and policies established by the Integris Board of Directors while overseeing the client-centric approach to sales, service, and support that are the company's hallmarks. His day-to-day activities consist of a varying slate of priorities, including managing business development, determining organizational direction, making key project decisions, interacting with human resources, and accounting. Craig has served as a member of the SPL leadership team and is also a member of the technical process and generic subteams. Before we start this expert panel discussion, Boris will start with a presentation, after which we will continue on with the expert discussion with our panelists. And Boris, without further ado, you may begin when you are ready.
Thank you so much, Deanne, and welcome everyone to this webinar on optimizing global labeling operations. And I'm really going to just speak for a few minutes here and really just to set up the panel discussion that's going to follow. And, you know, of course, I have to say that anything I say is my own opinion and does not necessarily represent those of Cyformix or of our clients or others involved in this webinar today. And really, the agenda for today, since we're talking about optimizing global labeling and looking at the evolution, more important, of labeling and how we see it progressing in the future, we do want to take a very brief look back as to where we have been, where we are now, and where we believe we're going. Now, again, these are going to be views that are general in nature. Everybody's experience in labeling will have been a little bit different, but these are generalized trends that we're also looking at that are impacting us from an entire industry perspective. And then really, as we jump off into the Q&A discussion, let's have a look at where we see the labeling group of the future to be positioned. So as we look at the past, and when I I say, you know, when I started in regulatory affairs and labeling maybe 10 to 12 years back, from experience and from having had a vast network of other labeling professionals around me, we can say that the label development in and by itself was sometimes very much disconnected from the drug product development process. When we look back and see that, you know, we have a target product profile owned by a commercial function with a set of parameters that will make a product marketable within a given region or patient population. That was always first, and then a clinical development program was developed. Was it developed with specifically the TPP, the target product profile, in mind? Sometimes. Were the two tracked and updated, you know, vice versa throughout the development program? Not often. And what happened was that at the end, when it became time to have a reconciled label and benefit risk profile, the commercially desired attributes along with the development program were not always matching, and the final approved label by health authorities at time of market was often different than the target product profile. One of the things we see in the labeling teams back then, and again, this is a general observation, not necessarily applicable to everyone, that labeling teams came in too late in the process, meaning that when the label had to be created, usually, you know, maybe 3 to 6 months pre-filing during the phase 3 development phase. But it was also seen as a very tactical or administrative function at the time. And that really sort of then resulted in the labeling groups really just consolidating some content that they received from various functions. Now, as we have progressed, and these progressions have come through various drivers, we see, you know, regulatory change and the physician labeling rule driving content evolution, but also organizational and internal maturity, really bringing labeling more and more into the forefront in drug development and being proactive throughout sort of the product life cycle, starting as early as end of phase 2 with the development of the target product label or target product profile that really is a proactively managed document that picks up from a commercial TPP. Also, more and more, and again, these are views that we have into different organizations, is labeling plays a key mediator role at this point between the development clinical functions, drug safety, manufacturing, CMC, and also commercial. and has really become sort of a linchpin in the benefit risk profile development and the subsequent communication cascade. Also, over the past 10 years, and we are glad to have some of these experts like Beth and Gria, but also Greg on the call with us, process integration with up and downstream stakeholders has become very, very big. And so I have touched a little bit on the upstream integration, specifically with clinical and the safety organizations, but also downstream with the folks that are responsible ultimately for implementing labeling. So I'm thinking about the folks that are generating artwork, but also that manage supply chain and making sure that that drug product gets out the door with the most recent labeling. And then, of course, technology has taken a foothold as well in global labeling. I think, you know, as the expectations by FDA, for example, with SPL have grown more and more over the recent decade, as well as other agencies like EMA looking at process and content control more specifically, technology enablers have, you know, really sort of driven both operational efficiency but also capability in managing the process. So that's kind of where we are. We need to look at, though, some of the realities and trends that are driving where we are going in the future, and certainly in the panel discussion today we'll address some of these. And a lot of these are not new per se, but some of these are somewhat undefined as of yet. So when we look at things like portfolio growth and geographies, that is something most successful pharma companies are facing now, and it's a good problem to have, but the increase in workload for a labeling department to manage, especially with a fixed resource pool, you know, to go into different geographies, wherever it may be, Asia Pacific, Latin America, is a very, very acute issue, as well as the need to kind of figure out how do we do this. And then one of the things that we talk about often, and specifically in the pharmacovigilance and in other domains, is the persistence of social media. And I think the key impacts here are going to be not just the increased expectations by the healthcare practitioner or HCP here, but more importantly, the expectations of the patient. We are seeing a much more informed and involved patient population. The consumer of labeling information is no longer just the learned intermediary, but also the patients themselves. So there is, you know, an expectation that content is readily available through multiple channels, various paths of dissemination, which then also creates a content control challenge to organizations. Evolving regulations, of course, we've talked about, I've touched on a couple of them, the EMA PV regulation of 2012 that really hones in on process and content control, but then also FDA revisiting the generic PV labeling regulations and the impetus for generic manufacturers to actually more proactively manage the safety profile or communicate it of generic medicines. But we could list others as well here, right? We could talk about e-labeling, which is actually next here, and other regulations that are coming up. In terms of e-labeling, of course, that is, you know, sort of the new thing that you know, in the persistence also probably with social media everyone is looking at, right? A faster, more nimble way of communication. So at the end of the day, though, global labeling teams, you know, I think within the context of evolving the organization, need to not just keep abreast, but ahead of these future trends. And that's very easily said, not as easily done, because at some point, you know, the global labeling team also needs to take charge and help the organization evolve. And that is something that is going to be a continuing theme. So continued systematic review, updating your intercompany roles and processes, of course, but also the skill of facilitating and leading change across a broad stakeholder network will be required. So in summary, what we start to see is more of a move towards information management and benefit risk communication management, which really goes beyond process and content. These aspects are already given. And it is really sort of the labeling group that we see at the center to help drive accurate and timely dissemination of benefit risk information, and not just to healthcare practitioners anymore, but also to patients and regulators, and via multiple channels. And so labeling groups have to evolve over time to become communication experts, really, and scientists that help drive benefit risk information dissemination. And because it is such a cross-functional effort, and the labeling group, again, sits at the center of that, their ability to facilitate and execute labeling updates and thinking of these in projects as projects helps drive these changes across the entire organization. So it's exciting times ahead for labeling. And with that, we're going to move on to the panel discussion. And I am very happy to have both Beth Gria and Greg with us today. Between the two of them, with Beth and Gria, they bring many years of experience, both from an innovator and generics side of the house, having worked in labeling for many years and faced a lot of the issues that we've talked about today. And with Greg, of course, we're happy to have him. Greg and his company have been at the forefront of labeling technology, working both in the SPL but also the workflow management and tracking domain. So between the three of them, we will have a very fruitful discussion. So jumping right into it, the first question really, Beth and Gria, is for you. We would like to hear from you, and based on the presentation earlier, what are your biggest drivers and challenges that you face regarding global labeling management? And let's talk about it in two parts. One, what's driving change in global labeling management, both at the macro and micro level? And then secondly, how is that impacting you? And what are the experiences that you get as a result of these drivers? And Beth, let's start with you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Boris. And first of all, let me say hello to everyone on the call, and also to thank Boris for the opportunity to be a panelist in today's discussion. In terms of what is driving the change at the macro level, I believe it really is from the continued increased focus on patient safety and advancing public health. The reality that we're all dealing with is that health authorities expect accurate prescribing information that's consistently updated globally in a timely fashion. And that really ties into what Boris has already communicated regarding the patient-centric label management. So then this creates challenges for us at the macro level. And by macro level, I mean the me and you level. And my observation regarding changes in managing global labeling really stem from the need to engage the current organizational structure and processes based on the trends that we're seeing regarding labeling, and really the ability to be nimble without getting bogged down in the complexity of the organizational structure. So timely compliance with changing regulations depends on having well-defined and consistently executed processes, well-defined roles and responsibilities across your organization, and the integration of the different stakeholders that are involved in your process. But really, at the end of the day, there needs to be a vetting across the functional teams so that there's a good understanding of the work that needs to be done. And it does sound very simple, but it results in a cohesive approach with a strategic focus on end-to-end labeling. As we know, compliance will always be challenging, but creating a focused strategy where everyone is viewing from the same lens helps to drive the same goal.
Fantastic. Thank you, Beth. And again, it goes back to what I think I was saying earlier too, around the labeling folks really being the driver of change, and also being the custodian of the end-to-end process to help drive changes across the organization. And Griya, with that, let's move on to you. Would you like to add something to this as well?
Hi, Boris. Thank you, and welcome to everyone on the webinar. As Beth stated, patient safety is, of course, everyone's concern, as it should be today. In pharma, what we're seeing as a result of this increased concern for our patients is change in regulation. So, of course, these drivers, as you asked about, Boris, often present themselves in the form of a new or a revised agency guidance or regulation. Some of the examples we've seen here in the U.S. include the recent pregnancy, lactation, and labeling rule, fondly known as PLLR, as well as you've also mentioned, the FDA's pending proposal for generic companies or companies marketing generics to revise their labels based on their own internal safety data. Another driver that we're seeing on the global level is we're having some of the smaller countries, some of the smaller markets, trying to adopt or align with some of the FDA's regulations. Now, this is great. We're moving towards a more regulated market. However, the challenge with that is these smaller emerging markets, which were not highly regulated in the past, are now basically forced to go from being provided very little health authority guidance to having to have regulations in place, which will, of course, impact their company's labeling processes. And lastly, one of the things that we can all relate to is our company's ever-changing portfolio. We work in a time where partnerships, in-licensing agreements, divestments, mergers, acquisitions happen to be the norm. And as a result of that huge driver, our labeling management process needs to be able to accommodate this scenario.
Thank you, Griya. And again, I think having you speak also on the regulated markets or actually geographic expansion, one of the key aspects I think that also we're starting to see is the impact of mergers and acquisitions on the labeling group, and the sort of internalization of a portfolio of drugs, and what that does actually, in getting new work in, but also going into new regions, and like you said, the maturization of various health authorities worldwide certainly always presents an interesting challenge. But I want to go back to a little bit. We talked about sort of the drivers now and some of the challenges. Let's look at the other side of the coin. And Griya, let's continue with you. What are the opportunities you see in some of these challenges? Specifically, how does that make you rethink your overall labeling operational strategy, right? And where do you think we can look at achieving operational excellence and additional efficiencies?
Yeah, of course. I mean, challenges are inevitable, but on a positive note, they create opportunities. So it kind of forces you in a way to reassess your current process, your tools, and really determine how you're going to be able to support these increase in your health authority expectations or obligations. So in looking at your process, your tools, your systems, your databases, if something is lacking, then take the opportunity to do an assessment and make a change. In some instances, you may actually need to do a complete overhaul. On the other hand, if your process seems to be working well, but there's only one aspect that you need to tweak in order to make this, to accommodate, let's say, a revised regulation, you can look to do some kind of an enhancement. So some of the examples that I mentioned before about, making sure you have a robust system in place, just to elaborate, having the proper documentation internally, of course, SOPs, a good training program, and a routine assessment of your system and your process, so that at least you're taking advantage of this opportunity to look at the entire system and hopefully fixing any identified problem.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I agree that I think challenges represent opportunities, and it's how an organization looks at it also that makes the difference, right? But Beth, I want to ask you as well around sort of the opportunities that you're seeing based on the drivers and how that makes you think about your operations.
Yeah. So thanks, Boris. You had touched on this within your presentation, and the point about needing to be strategic with respect to the process integration, both up and downstream. And so I'm going to further kind of touch on that. And within my own organization, we've tried to address that by implementing a CCDS process that starts with a holistic approach to the safety profile of any product by integrating our pharmacovigilance and their signal detection process with the regulatory strategy team and with our medical affairs organization. And within that process, we have defined new roles that we call regional coordinators, and they really act for us as the primary liaison between the global and local groups in regards to all of the labeling harmonization activities. And then they work with global and local to establish those implementation strategies for any of the label content changes. Now with respect to a tool perspective, we rely on our tracking tools. We have a tracking tool to provide the organizational transparency of all of our label updates and what the status is. And it really, with respect to our quality process, it complements that. The tracking tool complements our quality process at not only the global, but again, also at the local level. So it can help us to not only stay on top, as I stated earlier, of the status of the label updates, but it also gives us some insight into operationally how we're, where we're being efficient, where we're being inefficient. And it tells us if there are parts of the process that we're experiencing delays so that we can then try to address those. Another point that I'd like to communicate is that I think it is best practice to have a team dedicated to running your labeling process metrics. Again, this ties into what I've previously been talking about with label updates and statuses. And, the organization really should allow for development of talent to understand your process, and then what metrics you can pull from that and what those metrics are saying. And I think then that's where you'll be able to get at some operational excellence. I have one last point, and this is in regards to processes, and this is where I think that regulatory intelligence plays a big role. And a regulatory intelligence program specifically can help optimize labeling strategies by, number one, monitoring. So all about what is going on in the regulatory and compliance environment. And I also think that regulatory intelligence teams can help companies be more engaged with regulatory authorities and give them the opportunity to help shape future regulations, guidances, and policies, by commenting during, comment periods when there's a new regulation that's being proposed or drafted. And then ultimately, and in my opinion, what I think is the most important is helping to establish those positive regulatory and industry relationships.
Right. No, I think a couple interesting points here, right? So I think the link between the global organization and the local countries that have to implement labeling, and how you manage sort of the information cascade here, right down to from the global to the regional to the local level. And often, let's be clear, regional in the context of a health authority environment, it's really Europe, which is under EMA, but then you go global to local in most others fairly quickly. And I think that is one of those challenges that, again, Griya, another very good point here, and Beth, is the regulatory intelligence and being able to sort of look at not just requirements, but also trends at a local level. And very specifically, in my experience, I've seen that working with Brazilian regulators at Anvisa and others of how this can shape a strategy. So thank you for that. One of the things we talked about and mentioned here now was the role of technology, and I want to turn to technology a little bit and start with Griya and Beth here again. Beth, you briefly touched on your utilization of a workflow management tool, but let's hear from Griya as well. How are you using and implementing technology within your labeling process to manage the business?
Sure, yeah, of course. So obviously technology is important to us in the labeling management space, and it needs to, as we're learning, it needs to evolve based on growing needs. The system that you might have used 5 years ago as your documentation repository may not be the most ideal system to serve with fulfilling today's labeling needs. So as a result, I think in an ideal world, if you are able to have a system where you can take care of your document creation, document revision, it allows you to track all your labeling changes, including the global dissemination that needs to happen if this is a globally registered product. That's fantastic. Unfortunately, things are not always ideal. So you may need to have multiple systems to support your various processes. You may need to have a system for internal labeling changes, another for, if you're working with an external partner, another system or database may be needed to support that. And of course, on a global level, you need to make sure all of the markets have access to this one system, that your master system that you're using for labeling management. Another important feature of this, whether it's one master system or multiple systems that you're using, and I think Beth touched upon this, is measuring your internal metrics. So of course, it's great to be able to fulfill out all your obligations, but you obviously need to measure yourself against your internal company timelines if those are in place. So having a system that will help you to track compliance in the form of metrics specifically, I think is extremely helpful and beneficial, and it saves a lot of paperwork and a lot of counting down the road. And if you're able to have something where, you can have a snapshot of your entire labeling process without having to go to 3 or 4 or 5 different things, that's not a bad deal. I think what you would want to stay away from is having, half paper-based system and then the other half an actual automated. But again, it depends on the size of your portfolio, depends on, a majority of your products licensed, and you may have a partner that's doing 90% of the global labeling management, so you may just need a simple system to accommodate the other 10%.
Right, thank you. And a couple points again that I picked up on here as well is the integration and the implementation of a system down to the local level. But you also touched on partners, right, and the ability to have access here. Beth, let's hear from you. You previously mentioned workflow management. So if you want to add anything to Griya's comments here, please feel free.
Yeah, sure. We leverage a tracking tool that allows us to have an automated approach to a standardized metrics reporting program. So our tracking tool labeling updates are based on what we define as key milestones and key performance indicators. And, you know, a few of them that I'll mention here, and that will also give a view into how we have, as I've mentioned before, come up with a holistic approach to it. Is one of the key performance indicators or milestones is that we track when a safety signal is confirmed. And then we take that all the way through our process to when we've submitted that change to a labeling change to the agency, and then when the agency approves the change, and when the change then is implemented. So, and ultimately this tool provides us, provides the labeling team franchise and country RA, which again is really for us global and country RA, to have a standardized look at everything. And it really has allowed us to decrease our process tracking time.
That's very interesting, and I like the term standardized, and which is not always easy for companies because we love to customize and we love to you know, sort of have different standards also across different organizations. But Craig, we haven't heard from you yet, and I think for technology it will be interesting. You know, you've been doing this for a long time, and you've been on the forefront of the SPL movement and workflow management movement with your organization. But, you know, tell us a little bit from your perspective, you know, the tools that are available on the market now we've somewhat discussed, but what do you really see the next wave of technology to be in best practice? So how do you see things evolving?
Thanks, Boris, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak and present for you today. What we're starting to see a lot of within the industry is more web-based applications that are very light and accessible online across the team at an enterprise level, so that the organization, as it grows and changes, the organization can continue to operate in a model that without having to worry about licensing or things like that. Additionally, these systems have to be able to integrate well with existing systems, as we're seeing the proliferation of additional regulations that are coming out of FDA and EMA for electronic submissions and electronic standards. And additionally, as we're starting to see more and more within audits that health authorities are wanting to have information on safety information and updates, these systems have to be able to sit across divisions of the organization, all the way from upstream from safety and identification of safety items, all the way down to the implementation through, you know, ERP systems like SAP. So we're starting to see a high demand for the ability to pull and aggregate data across systems, and to be able also, while doing that, still enforce the workflow processes, and also still enforce some things and identify some things that are very specific to the pharmaceutical global regulatory process, such as product dependencies, where you have countries that are dependent on other countries having their label updated first. An example of that is like Ecuador might depend heavily on the United States to have FDA approval for product labeling before they can even submit to their health authority. So we're seeing that systems have to be intelligent enough to know that those relationships exist, and to be able to identify and to notify and alert the appropriate resources of when those things happen, when something's on the clock or not, when there's an assignment or not. Additionally, what's recently come out of the 2012 pharmacovigilance EMA legislation is a high need to be able to track and identify deviations where they occur within the organization from product to product and country to country. So the applications need to be able to provide a very granular level of detail on where are these deviations, how are they categorized, how are they exactly different from either the core label or other labeling or reference labeling, and what was the organization's decision on that, and how did it get there. So we're starting to see that the systems need to be able to provide that, and provide it in a very clear, concise, and quick manner. Again, I mentioned integration. being able to pull some of this data from other systems, such as what is a product name in each market, where is it registered, what are the appropriate registration numbers, et cetera, and what are the approval dates, et cetera, so that you know when something has to be done and the application can drive that workflow, provide alerts, reminders, and notifications in templates that are configurable to each user while still having the same base code. In the end, what it really means, what's really important though is the ability for transparency and reporting. We're seeing that organizations need to be able to answer a multiplicity of different questions that arise within the organization or from audits from health authority, and those ranging from how well are we doing on a performance that we've set up, how well are we doing on implementations for a specific update, and from a safety perspective, where are deviations, what are they saying, do they impact dependent countries or not, etc. So all those nuances and intrinsicies that are very specific to the global pharmaceutical regulatory process have to be built into systems, and we're starting to see a more and more demand for that.
Okay. Thank you, Greg. And I think that the key things that I hear is that, that these systems now, you mentioned web-based, so they're lighter systems, but there's also a level probably of standardization versus customization that at the end of the day, because of the cross-functional nature of the labeling process and the integration into other functions, that is a key component of them. I want to tug on one string that you mentioned right now, which was labeling variations or deviations from the core data sheet to local labeling. And we actually had an audience question that just come in, and this is really for Beth, you, and Gria to sort of answer as well. And we'll start with Beth after I read the question here, so get ready. But the question from the audience really was, how do you most effectively manage local label discrepancies from core labels, in particular managing differences in supporting information? So when you have the challenge that clinical approvals differ between health authorities, and then how do these changes impact regulatory compliance going forward? So this is a loaded question with a lot of content, and we can debate this probably in a whole other webinar. But Beth and Gria, and Beth first, why don't you give us your perspective on this?
Sure. So I think it's first I think it's important to understand the difference between a core document, so a company core data sheet, and a label, a local label, where we need to keep in mind that a company core data sheet is really the company's position on the safety profile. So it can integrate all of the different data that has been obtained and collected, not only from a clinical perspective, it can be from when you have an older product, literature-based information, and really what is the company's position on all of that data, and that's representative of the safety profile that the company puts forth, and obviously, again, supported and backed by scientific evidence. Then you have your local label, which should align to the CCDS, which is the minimum amount of safety information that needs to be in your label. But the label can and will differ based on regulatory and regional differences. So having that understanding going forward, I think, is very helpful, because you want alignment between the CCDS and your label as much as you can, but understanding that there will be differences and the basis of those differences. And so, Craig did touch a bit on this in where he talked about being able to manage deviations. And so from my perspective, it's about having a process that can document when a country label is deviating from the company's safety profile and why. So what are the regulatory influences? What are those regional differences where a country label has to differ, and keeping track of that and documenting it, and also bringing it to light to all of the functional members of the organization so that they are understanding the differences in the label from the CCDS and what those deviations are. And then from an acceptability standpoint, is it acceptable to deviate in that respect based on what we know about the product and what we feel our data is representative of? So I'll leave it open then. I know I've taken quite a bit of time to try to explain that, but again, it was a pretty in-depth question. So I'll kind of pass it over to Griya if she has anything else that she wants to add to that.
Thanks, Beth. No, I really think you summed it up very well. You know, in order for you to be able to justify a local label discrepancy, I mean, this is very simple terms because this is a very this is a great question, but it has a lot of consideration. It's important to have the relevant documentation in place that is justifying that discrepancy. And as Beth noted, you know, your market, your regulation, your local health authority may allow you to completely veer from the core data sheet, and that's fine, but making sure that the proper documentation is in place so that you can justify this discrepancy, because obviously you want to make sure there is some sort of an audit trail. And then the other thing is notifying the appropriate stakeholders so it doesn't raise any red flags or any major concerns, that you are allowed. You know, this is an allowable discrepancy. Now, the core data sheet, you know, there may be a need depending on the data that is not aligning with the core data sheet, that you kind of need to consider the other aspect of that, which is you're having the market talk with the local health authority and having some dialogue back and forth, because you may feel strongly that this safety information in the core data sheet needs to go into your local label, despite the fact that it may not be aligning with the health authority regulation. But I think, Beth, you summed it up very well. I don't have anything, you know, brand new to add to how you responded.
Okay, yeah, and so I think, you know, thank you, Beth and Griya, for that. I think the one thing that, you know, from my experience as well that I see is, you know, knowledge across an organization is sort of, you know, a lot of the times, you know, what we call tribal knowledge or invested in the people themselves. And so when we go through an exercise of managing a variation at a local level, we at one point are always aware as to why it happened, what the supporting material or rationale was behind it, and sort of move on. I think where, you know, we see the use of technology and process maturity help us is that what you were saying, Griya, right? Having the appropriate audit trail and knowing, you know, 5 or 10 years from now, when maybe a new reviewer does an audit on your labeling at a local level, saying, why did this decision happen? Who made the decision? And where are the supporting materials? And I see organizations struggle with that, and I think Craig had touched on it in his technology overview, that this sort of now becomes very important, and we're going more into a realm of content management, right? And Craig, I just, you know, because it was pretty interesting what Beth and Griya said, just sort of wanted to give you the opportunity to sort of, you know, highlight what you see some of the management, you know, sort of from a systematic perspective would be to manage, you know, global versus local and the variations, if you have anything to add.
Sure, yeah, I do. One thing that I see instantaneous benefit for organizations, especially when the product portfolio set starts to get large, and as you start to have more and more markets that have products. Obviously, you can think about it from a small corporation like a biotech, right? A biotech with 1 or 2 products in maybe 10 markets. Well, managing that, you can do that probably in a spreadsheet, or you can do that in an Access database to some extent. But at some point, managing that and the number of submissions that you're going to have and the number of updates you're going to have per label, per product, per country, it starts to grow and scale. So having a system that manages that and does it so in an intelligent manner, meaning knows which markets are impacted by an update to a particular product label, and then also manages the dependencies, that's pretty key. And there's a lot of efficiency gained and also a lot of transparency, reporting, and the ability to manage it in a mature way that's gained from a system. And we're seeing that benefit companies more and more from a system standpoint. When I touched on this, I think, earlier, and I heard Griya touch on it, was that the management of the dependencies, the deviations or variations, is pretty critical and difficult to do as you start to think about the number of markets. So the more you have these sub-markets and the more products you have in these markets, the more you'll probably need to rely on technology to be able to identify and manage those in an efficient way.
Right. And I think, to your point, Craig, I think the information that supports a variation at the local level also sits in many different systems, whether it's a Documentum system or a regulatory milestone or regulatory decision registration system. So the integration of all of these, is quite a big task at the end of the day. So we have about 6 minutes left. We have one other question from the audience that I kind of liked here too, and this again sort of is to Beth and Griya specifically, and around sort of an example, really a real life example of troubleshooting and successfully fixing sort of an issue within the global labeling process and the system, right? And I can start, so the question is, can you give an example of troubleshooting and successfully fixing a problem in sort of your global labeling process, the master system that we had previously talked about? And to me, this went, very specifically across the horizontal integration of the process. So in this example here, what we had is a very good process that integrated safety and clinical information into developing a label. There was a process break, however, in implementing the label, into artwork and others. And the result here was, of course, that we had too many labeling changes that sort of resulted in artwork rework, but also, a lot of scrap. So that was an issue because we couldn't implement, the most current label in a timely fashion. So what we had to do is really charter and develop an entire program around having the process integrated downstream with other stakeholders, and specifically around planning and decision making. What changes do we implement now in labeling? Which ones do we hold back to let another critical change pass through? And the bundling, right? And then getting it into artwork and getting it onto website into a in a very quick and concise fashion that doesn't paralyze the entire organization that has to implement it. So that is my example. Maybe Beth, let's start with you if you want to give us an example of where you have successfully sort of identified and fixed an issue within your labeling process.
Yeah, thanks, Boris. I liked your point about planning and decision making and utilizing the tools that you have at hand within an organization to allow for better planning and decision making. But so within my organization, I would say that this goes back to the tracking tool that I was talking about earlier, and it's really about decreasing our ability to understand where our labeling updates are. And we had initially, before our automated tracking tool, we had a paper-based system, and it was really cumbersome and limiting with respects to not being able to real-time understand where your label status is in a country, in a region, globally in order then to better plan and make decisions on what types of changes you're going to make next. So the tracking tool allowed us to have, again, real-time access to this information at our fingertips so that we can be more planful and have more engaged decision-making immediately.
Phenomenal. Thank you. And Griya, in the last minute or so, would you like to add an example?
Yes, please. We actually had a great system in place that we were using to track labeling changes. The portfolio changed, and we had some new products come in, but this particular genre of products were not a part of the new system. So once this was identified, we decided to just go ahead and do a trial run with a small subset of that new part of the portfolio to see if the various markets that would be using it globally would be able to benefit, and if everything would align, and of course all the changes would register. So that actually worked out well, and we were able to bring the new part of the portfolio into the system, as opposed to use, Beth mentioned, the paper trail or the local systems that each of the markets were using to kind of satisfy their day-to-day needs. Everyone was able to start using this global system. And as I said, we started with, one product a month just to kind of see how we could slowly phase it all in. And it worked out fine.
Right. Interesting. And thank you so much. And we are at time. So I really want to thank the panelists, Beth, Griya, and Craig, for joining us today. I think we had a very, very nice discussion. Now, we covered a lot of ground, and I think a lot of these issues and topics that we brought up, anyone could warrant another individual webinar, if not an entire symposium. But there are a few key themes that we've heard over and over today, and especially as we look into the future of global labeling. One is the process integration, stakeholder integration, both upstream and downstream, and making sure that functional teams are aligned towards the goal of managing the global label worldwide. And with that, I think, we've talked a lot about also the global to local or regional nature of labeling, that as companies expand, more and more has to be a focus. And that there are new tools coming out, and that there are new ways of working or, sort of are being developed. And it's very exciting time, I think, in global labeling. And, we'll look forward to, sort of monitoring and being part of it over the next years to come. So again, thank you to all panelists, and thank you for joining us today. I will now hand it back over to Deanne. Thank you.
Thank you, Boris, and to all our panelists, Beth, Griya, and Craig, for this expert discussion. If you have any further questions, please direct them to the email addresses shown on your screen. And thank you, everyone, for participating in today's conference. You will be receiving a follow-up email with access to the recorded archive of this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us improve our future webinars. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers. And we hope you found this conference informative. Have a great day, everyone.